In this final video, we're going to look at inflation and the impact of inflation in our actual lives using something called the Consumer Price Index, also called the CPI. In this Excel file, these data, which I pulled from a primary source, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, tells us the CPI in each year from 2011 to 2021, at the beginning of each year that is, using a base year of 2011. What does that mean? That means that, first of all, although they don't use the percentage, each CPI should be considered a percent. So the CPI in 2012 was, the index says that prices are approximately 102.93% of the prices in 2011. The prices in 2014 were 106.22% of the prices in 2011, and so on and so forth. How do they determine prices? Well, they create what they would consider a typical basket of goods purchased by consumers over the course of a year, and they research their prices, averaging across the country, in order to develop the CPI. The CPI will tell us, for example, the inflation rate, which is defined now to be the percentage change in the CPI. In the last video, we actually looked at the purchasing power of those lingots in terms of purchasing a streak freeze, a very specific basket of one good. Now we're looking at the percentage change in the average prices across a whole basket of goods. So we can calculate that as the percentage change in Excel. So let's do that. So of course it doesn't make sense to calculate in year one, in 2011. We'll call that year zero actually, because there's no previous, there's no old to compare it to. So we'll start calculating the inflation rate in 2012. And remember what percentage change is. Percentage change is new minus old. So the new is 2012's 2012 CPI minus the old 2011 CPI divided by the old 2011 CPI. Notice I had to put the subtraction in parentheses. That's because under PEMDAS, under ordinary order of operations, without the parentheses, Excel would have divided B2 by B2 first and then subtracted from B3. To get Excel to do the subtraction first, we use parentheses. So I'll hit enter, and I pre-formatted this to be in percentage terms, and it's rounded to 3% approximately. So let's drag this down and see what the inflation rates are for other years. And I would like to get a little bit more accuracy. So let's get 2 decimals of accuracy. Notice there was a tiny amount of deflation in 2015. That's kind of interesting. That's extremely rare, especially in our economy. But mostly we've been looking between 1% and 2% and occasionally over 3%. How does this affect our lives? Well, prices are going up, so that means the purchasing power of what we earn, goes down, unless what we earn keeps up with inflation. So let's look at an example where in 2011 our monthly rent was $700. We're working minimum wage, that's $7.25 an hour, and that hasn't changed. That went into effect before 2011 and is still the minimum wage today federally, although in many states it's higher. For example, here in Michigan, if it's not $10, it's very close. Anyhow, assuming we're making the federal minimum wage, how many hours per month is it going to take us to make rent, assuming rent increases with the CPI? Well, one thing we can do is we can use the percentage changes in the inflation rates, but I want to show you how to use the CPI to actually do these calculations. Basically, what you do is you multiply by a ratio of the CPIs. Here's how to think about it. Money's value in one year is a different unit from its value in a different year. 2014 dollars are a different currency unit than 2011 dollars. So we use the CPI to create a unit change, a conversion of units from one year's dollars to the other. Let me show you how this is done. So as a unit conversion, if you take a look at this example, what we've got here is the cost, that is the rent in year 0, which I said was 700, times the CPI in year T divided by the CPI in year 0. So I'm going to look at year 3. So what does that mean? Well, the CPI in year 0 is in year $0, as is the cost in year 0. So the year $0 cancel, and you're left with with year T dollars. Let's do the calculation as an example. So from the spreadsheet, the CPI in year 0 was 100. That was what it means to be the base year. It's 100% of its years, all the other CPIs compared to year 0. The CPI in year 3 is 106.22. The rent in year 0, as you'll recall, was 700, and we multiply that by the CPI in year 0 divided by the CPI, sorry, that was the CPI in year 3 divided by the CPI in year 0. This is in 2011 dollars, as is the 700. The 2011 dollars cancels, and we're left with units of 2014 dollars. If you perform the calculation, you end up getting $743.54. This tells us how to convert from dollars in one year to dollars in the next year. Let's go back to our spreadsheet and figure out how our rent would change if it kept pace with the CPI. So what we're going to do is adjust our rent for each year's CPIs. So what we'll do is we'll take the previous month's rent, which in this case is D2, multiply it by the top is this year's CPI, which is C3, B3, it's the inflation rate, divided by last year's CPI, which is B2. And now we'll drag this and drop it. So there's the amount we calculated by hand a minute ago. Notice it went down just a sliver in 2015 from the deflation. But overall, over this 10 years, rent increased from 700 to 831.46. So if you take a look at one of these, let's look at the formulas. You'll see what it did was it took the previous year's monthly rent and multiplied it by this year's CPI, but divided by the previous year's CPI. Previous year's units of currency canceling, living in units of, in this case, 2019 dollars. So this is how our rent grew. Now let's see how this impacts how many hours per month it'll take to make rent. We're not going to worry about the fact that there are withholdings like Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security and FICA. We'll just assume that we're looking at gross wages here. So we'll just divide the rent per month by the hourly wage. So in this case, that's D2 is our $700 per month divided by $7.25 an hour. Oops, I'm just going to make this E2. Why type it when it's already in there? And according to this, it takes us 96 hours of work to make rent on minimum wage in 2011 if you have a $700 rent. So working 40 hours a week, that's about 2.5 weeks of work. Let's see how inflation changed that. This is hard to read, so I'm going to go ahead and reduce the decimal accuracy so we can, let's go to 1 decimal. By the end of this year, by the end of 2021, we've gone to needing to work almost 115 hours in a month in order to make our rent, if the rent went up with inflation. So what's going on here? This is the kind of the summary of both what we saw with linkets and now what we're seeing with actual expenses, is that currency, the unit of currency depends on the relative prices underlying the economy, whether in a game or in reality. So every year we have different units, and we have to be sure that we're consistent when we're making comparisons. This is another aspect of data, is thinking about how the underlying value of the data may change over time. This concludes our introduction to data and concludes chapter 1. In the next chapter, we're going to look specifically at different types of data distributions and how to describe the way data is distributed.